Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We are really excited about today's topic, and the topic being cybersecurity, and really specifically, how does it relate to CPAs, tax preparers, and then so understanding how to really have a secure organization, but then also understanding the IRS's guidelines for organizations like yours. My name is Taylor Wells. I am the Director of Strategy here at NW Techs. I'm joined today by Justin Best, who is our founder and president, and Kevin French, who is our Director of Central Services, to discuss all these things today. Thanks, guys, for being here.
Thanks, Taylor, for having us.
I do want to have a little disclaimer before we get started. We are not representatives of the IRS. This is, as we go through this process of going through this guide and understanding their requirements, and really just understanding best practices from our experience being IT consultants. That being said, these IRS guidelines are actually, in a large way, really helpful for organizations to kind of benchmark what cybersecurity structures they have in place, what IT structures you have in place. And so we're really excited to go through those. And then on top of that, kind of show you our best practices for CPAs and tax preparers. And don't worry, we're going to be going through a lot of technical nitty-gritty, which you can definitely watch later on a recording, which we will be recording the webinar. But then also you can reach out to us after the fact if there's a specific technical thing that we brought up that you're like, hey, this raised a red flag. We'll have some actionable next steps for you guys to take towards the end of the webinar that you guys can participate in. In addition to that, just kind of some other housekeeping items. I mentioned the recording, so we will be recording the webinar. So if you're not able to attend the whole event, no worries, we'll be recording it, and you'll be able to watch it after the fact and share with any colleagues or any other members of your team. That being said, we will have a Q&A towards the end. So if you want to get answers to your questions, you can definitely participate in that as well. A couple instructions on the Q&A. You can look at the chat box in the Zoom webinar. Click on the chat box and you can either send a message to the panelists, which is us three, and then we can try to integrate that question through our presentation and try to address it in the Q&A later. And that's the quickest way to get the questions to us. A couple other things that we're looking for outcomes before we jump into the agenda. A couple of the outcomes we're looking to achieve here is first, how do we protect you, yourself, your clients, your employees, your vendors, and your families better? Number two, how to understand the IRS's guidelines. And ultimately through that is to learn both of those things as we're even going through this guide. Every organization has its specific nuances, and even the IRS numerous times throughout their guide mentions, hey, based upon your organization's size, what type of tools you use, this may or may not be applicable. And so please send in questions, please participate in the chat so we can tailor this experience to your organization. That way you can better understand the cybersecurity questions. A little bit about us. We are an IT advisory firm, so we have been doing IT support services for small to medium-sized organizations, and we work with most organizations under about 250 employees. Our sweet spot is really organizations that don't have necessarily have a large enough need for an entire IT department, but still have the requirements or the desire to have those systems and procedures in place. Kind of a high-level overview of the agenda before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of each topic. An overview, first on the agenda, we're going to be going through an overview. And the overview kind of breaks down actually the guide, which the IRS has put together. The guide is really broken up into two different parts. It has the IRS's specific guidelines, which go into, hey, if you are a CPA firm or a tax preparer, you're going to deal with these unique challenges. Unlike unlike maybe an insurance brokerage or maybe another type of financial institution. And then they also talk about the FTC guidelines, which is what all financial institutions fall under. So kind of part one of the webinar will be going into the IRS's kind of specific, and that's kind of the first three presentations: protecting your clients, protect yourself, be on guard, and learning how to report and respond in an incident. And then the second part, we're going to be going into the FTC's guidelines, which applies to all financial institutions, which honestly, from our standpoint, is a lot of really best practices, which we like to encourage our clients and what we implement for a lot of our clients. And then we'll be wrapping up with the big four, which is the 4 things your organization should be looking at. And if any one of those areas aren't in check, there's probably a potential compliance issue with the IRS, or just a cybersecurity data breach potential issue. And then we'll be wrapping it up with some Q&A. If you would like to follow along, I know in some of the communications you probably saw the IRS Safeguarding Handbook. I'll be sending this out to everyone in the chat. If you want to read along with some of the areas that we'll be discussing, we actually pulled a lot of the bullet points in sections from that guide. That way it's helpful for you to understand kind of what we're talking about, and to really understand the IRS's guidelines for yourself, and make the best decision for your organization moving forward from there. Fantastic. So a little bit more about the overview. I kind of mentioned some of these things already. We're going to be talking about understanding the basic security best practices and how to take them, recognizing the signs of data theft and how to respond to data theft, and then ultimately understanding the FTC's guideline rules. So the first section we're going to jump into in the IRS guideline, which they put out, which is really just putting in best practices for CPAs and tax preparers from the IRS's standpoint. And there's kind of five areas that they recommend for protecting your clients and for protecting yourself. And I'll be going through each one of these, and from our experience, showing you what we've implemented for clients, what we implement for ourselves, and what we've implemented for other CPA firms or tax preparers. As we kind of go through each one of these, I'll be kind of referencing that. And they really break it out. The first area, when they talk about basic cybersecurity steps, the first one they mention is training. So as an organization, do you have a training platform that's training your employees and yourself on recognizing specific IRS potential scams out there, but then also just general cybersecurity best practices, right? Whether it's how to recognize a phishing campaign, or whether it's how to manage your passwords, all the different types of kind of best practices. Do you have a training plan in place? Another thing they mentioned is a security plan, and this is another thing that is a kind of another basic best practice that all organizations should have to some extent. But having a security plan in place that has policies, guidelines, a specific individual that's assigned to be an officer that can respond to specific situations. The IRS recommends having some sort of plan in place, not only that you have policies in place to recognize issues, but then also what are your day-to-day policies for how you're operating? Where are you storing your files? And how are you responding to different issues? The next one they kind of go into in the basic security steps is reviewing internal controls. And the internal controls are really a bunch of things. They're different. Think of them as, if you look at financial controls, there are different aspects of looking at managing where the data is going and looking at how it's impacted. So all these different areas could be making sure that things get deleted off of hard drives, or making sure you encrypt any files or emails to make sure that any sensitive data that is in transit won't there isn't any way that it can get compromised. Another area it talks about is how you limit people in the organization to different areas of data, right? Whether it's passwords or client data in particular. I think especially when it comes to CPA firms, and we'll be talking about this a lot throughout the throughout and kind of talking through different scenarios. But where you store your data, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's on-prem servers, that's super important because there's a ton of internal controls for how you access that data. If it's on an on-premise server, if it's located in your office, there is numerous ways people can get access to it, not only physically, but also through the internet or through your network or all sorts of different ways. So understanding what processes you have in place and reviewing those to see, hey, do we have everything in place to make sure wherever we have sensitive data, wherever we have client data or even our own internal data, we have the internal controls. We review those internal controls to make sure we haven't lost anything. A couple of the things under the basic security steps, which we'll be talking about, is reporting theft and data loss, which we'll be covering later on in the webinar. So yeah, the next section would be use of security software, which is point number 2. And this is a lot of stuff you've probably heard before, using an antivirus. You'd be surprised though, and I'm sure it happens in your organization where you have an antivirus in place, but maybe not everyone is using it, or maybe it's different versions, or it's not up to date. So making sure your antivirus or your anti-spyware is up to date and current is something that needs to happen, and is something I know for our clients in our organization. Not only do you need to keep up to date, but sometimes you need to change the provider because some solutions get better and worse and so on and so forth. Other things like under the security software, they throw in firewalls as well as something that is great for protecting your overall network, but then also firewalls, particularly on your computers, and then in your network in your office as well. Point number 3, strong passwords. This is also something that you're probably familiar with. I think the biggest thing, we'll be probably hitting on this a lot throughout this webinar and talking more in depth about them as well. I know Justin is going to talk some in his presentation about password managers, but for creating strong passwords is really essential for your organization, especially when it comes to cloud-hosted solutions, right? We're only putting more stuff in the cloud. So having robust passwords, having a variety of passwords, and then sharing them effectively is something people don't talk about. Sharing them, how you share them in your organization. I know we have specific passwords that we use. For example, we purchase hardware for our clients. So we share logins to different suppliers that we're buying hardware for our clients. And we got to share that, we obviously need to have a way to share that quickly and then also safely. And that's something your organization should definitely look at when it comes to creating strong passwords. And then the other thing too, that, they have a list of about, I think it's 10 or 12 things that you should do to create a strong password. Number one thing that resonates with me would definitely be a password manager, because it helps with pretty much all the other areas. And then number 2, don't reuse passwords. I think that's something that is still a bad habit that we see a lot of people struggle with, and something that is something we have to constantly be battling ourselves, of making sure that we're creating a variety of passwords that are strong and not just reusing it. Because once you have, another thing we'll be talking through the presentation, phishing campaigns, someone gets access to one of your passwords, it could be a chain link effect over a long period of time where they compromise your entire system or log in because of getting one password. And then ultimately, so using a password manager being one of them, like 1Password or LastPass, we'll be talking more about that. And then definitely not reusing passwords would be another thing. And of course, they talk about where you store passwords and store them in a secure place, stuff like that, which would ultimately help you if you had a password manager and implemented that. It does take work and it does take effort to implement one. So definitely rely on your IT department or your IT provider to implement it, because it does take training, just like any tool. But once you implement it, I think I save at least 15 minutes a day because of a password manager. Not only am I exponentially more safer, but it's just so much quicker, because we're all dealing with tens, if not hundreds, of different passwords or logins, depending on our position and our organization. So the fourth thing here is secure wireless network. So if you have a home office or an office, a physical office, brick and mortar office, then it talks a lot about making sure you have things like an effective router, strong password in place, and then also making sure you don't access unsecure wireless networks when you're working remotely. A lot of that is also things you've heard as well. I think the biggest thing that stands out is making sure you have it's worth the investment getting a good router and access point and firewall, especially if you have an office, and especially if you're using Wi-Fi a lot. If you're working from home, which a lot of us were already, and some of us are going to continue to work from home in various capacities, there's benefits to even implementing having stronger routers at home, or access points, not only for security, but then just reliability. We use a lot of data these days, whether for video chat or whether for just communicating at home or at work. The fifth thing is protect stored client data. And this is something we could probably talk a couple hours on, just because this is a lot, especially when it comes to CPA firms, and as you know, for your firm. And this is something that ultimately is really, it really depends on your organization. There's a lot of different ways we could take this. I'm going to talk about, first talk about a lot of clients that have on-prem servers or have servers that are on-site. We're gonna start there. And then I'm going to touch on organizations that are already in the cloud and talk about how these things apply to you and kind of the best practices that we take. So number one, let's talk about organizations that still have servers or have servers on site for various reasons. Talking about storing data. So number one, they talk a lot about making sure you don't use USB drives. So if you have a server, a lot of times people back up to a USB drive or an external drive. Doing that with client-specific data, that it sounds like a great idea when it comes to having a backup, but there's various reasons. The first question is it encrypted? So a lot of times those drives aren't encrypted. So if they are, there may be a good reason to use that external drive if it's encrypted. But that's kind of the first red flag of, hey, is it encrypted? And a lot of times you can't guarantee that, or people just pull out, a tablet or a USB that's a personal one that they end up using that's not encrypted, and then somehow that gets lost in transit, and now you have client data out there. So biggest thing is encryption. Another thing with on-prem servers is who has access to it. So having robust logs, that's something we look at, making sure if it does have regulated data, whether even if it's a HIPAA-related organization, or FINRA, not even just IRS, making sure you have a robust log, who's accessing that server, and that kind of goes back to the controls ultimately. If you have policies and procedures in place for those servers of like, hey, who's accessing the data, when is it being accessed, how is it being backed up? Because that's another thing as well. You could have a really safe server, but getting it backed up to external sources, there's a kind of a bunch of issues there, and which we all, I think for some level, definitely want our backup of especially our on-prem servers. So one way to do that is to back up to the cloud, and that could be a very efficient, safe way to do that. So if you still have a server or still using servers on site, and you have a continued need for that, backing up to the cloud is one way. Another way is to consider migrating to the cloud. I know we've worked with organizations, talked with many of them that use robust practice management softwares that can house a lot of your data in the cloud for you, for your specific organization. And then there's also Microsoft 365 or a lot of other solutions that you can use to get your data to the cloud. And then also on top of that, if anyone has any questions in the Q&A, we'd be happy to talk about this, because I know Justin and Kevin and other members of the team have been working on virtualization. So it's kind of one step further. If you still want the control of the server, and you have maybe a proprietary software, or you have multiple versions of QuickBooks or multiple accounting softwares that you're using that you have to have on your own server, and then you also want to have an environment that is controlled. One thing we've been doing is virtualizing people's servers to the cloud, and then having people basically have a basic computer that then logs into the cloud to access that server, which is kind of best of both worlds, in the sense of you get the cloud, but then you also still get the control, customization, the freedom to kind of expand and to have those specific needs if the cloud-based version of whatever you're using isn't working, or if you just want more control and want to have multiple applications, or you want to have a central place. And it really decentralizes your hardware. It makes it so you don't have to have robust hardware, because people are ultimately connecting to the cloud more than storing stuff locally or having to connect to a server locally or things like that. So those are kind of the ideas kind of on where to store data, how to store it in the cloud, or virtualization. There's a lot that you could do there to figure out how to get your client's data more protected. Ultimately, ease of use, that's another thing too. Whether you're going to the cloud or whether you're going virtualization, either scenario, the ease of use of not having to maintain a server in a physical location based on power and internet and all those needs, whether you're doing it or whether your IT provider is doing it, that's just it's a taxing demand to have those on-prem servers or on-premise servers. So having those servers either migrated to the cloud or virtualized, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do there to not only make your organization more secure, but ultimately make it more efficient and just a long-term more cost-effective to maintain, especially with storing data, having redundant backups. That's another thing with backups. Things we're talking about now, and I know we'll talk about more in the presentation as well, is backups and where are we storing backups? Because if your stuff is in the cloud, if all your data is in the cloud, are you backing it up to a server, or are you on site, or are you backing up to another cloud location? And one little tidbit, Microsoft or Google, they recommend, so they promise all your data is secure in the email, or if you have an email there. But if someone were to accidentally go in there and delete an email, or for some reason something were to get compromised and someone were to log in and delete emails maliciously, they can't promise that they can recover that. So they actually recommend that you create a backup or have a backup of your emails and your cloud based Microsoft and Google products. And so now we're recommending backing up the cloud to another cloud location, which is great, but and kind of solves that solution of having that multiple redundancy, and ensuring you making sure you have the backups in place. So yeah, that is pretty much covers the first section of the IRS's protect your clients and protect your emails. The next section we're going to be jumping into, I'm going to be passing over to Justin, which is how to be on guard and take proactive steps, and specifically for IRS organizations that deal with the IRS, like CPA firms and tax preparers. So Justin, let's talk about be on guard.
Absolutely. Great stuff, Taylor. So yeah, happy to look at this. So I'm going to go through the be on guard section. We're going to talk about spotting data theft and monitoring EFINs and prepare tax identification numbers. So let's jump right in. So let's talk about spotting data theft. When we talk about spotting data theft, most of this is really just common sense. When you look at the guidelines that are are provided here, most of it just makes sense. So an example of a red flag, right? Client e-filed tax returns begin to reject as already filed. That's because someone else has filed on behalf of that taxpayer. Now, the e-filing error messages, they've gotten, in my opinion, a lot smoother over the years. We used to see crazy messages that didn't necessarily mean what they thought they meant. But in the last couple of years, we've experienced things running a lot smoother. Yeah, but we've we've seen e-filing errors pop up. So pay attention to e-filing errors, right? It may not be a software error. Software errors are really frustrating, and you got to figure out what's wrong with my tax software. Maybe there's nothing wrong with your tax software. Maybe that client really has already had a tax return filed because of data theft. Another red flag, unexpected communications from the IRS, right? Authorization letters, authentication letters, transcripts, notices that your client's account was accessed, etc. Again, this is just common sense type stuff. This is really no different than monitoring your credit. If your bank were to send you a letter in the mail saying congratulations on your new credit card, you would want to investigate that, right? And the same thing here. If the IRS is sending acknowledgments to things that you never initiated, you'll want to follow up with that and understand why they're responding. Training, honestly, we recommend ongoing security training because the reality is that new scams emerge all the time, right? COVID specifically caused new scams to emerge, and we're seeing websites designed to steal data and specific scams related to COVID. There are always going to be new issues that pop up and new scams that didn't exist before. And so ongoing training to make yourself and your staff aware of new threat vectors is something that's extremely important in spotting data theft. You can know really well how the threat landscape looks today, and next year it could look significantly different. That's where ongoing training is really important. Let's talk about another red flag, replies to emails that you didn't send. This is a concern, right? Maybe someone broke into your email, but maybe not. This is something that may or may not represent a breach in your email system. And honestly, this is a pretty frequent request for us as a tech team to investigate. So one possible cause for emails that you didn't send getting replies is something called spoofing. Spoofing is when an unauthorized party, a hacker, sends an email that looks like it's actually from you, but it isn't. You didn't send it, they did. And these days, it's very easy for hackers to spoof an email address. And this is because when the internet and email were originally designed, security wasn't only not in place, but it was discouraged. Email servers were open, right? We wanted to increase adoption of email as a thing. And so email servers agreed to pass along messages for everyone. So that's kind of intrinsic in the design of the email system. That said, things have changed, right? Everyone uses email now, and things are much more locked down by default. But there's still some exceptions allowed for companies doing it the old way, which can cause spoofing to be really easy. We highly recommend that you talk to your IT provider and lock down your email. There are new technologies that basically define the permitted sources from your email. So now, if email comes from yourdomain.com, there's a record on the internet for the tools that you should be authorized to send on behalf of yourdomain.com. So some of the acronyms here are SPF, Sender Policy Framework, DKIM, Domain Keys Integrated Mail, and then DMARC, which I can't remember what DMARC stands for on the top of my head. But IT people and tax professionals, I think, share a love for acronyms. So that's something that, the summary is you can lock down your domain, your company's .com, to make it more resilient against spoofing. And talk to your IT provider to make sure that you've done what needs to be done there to make it less likely. Because yeah, it is an opportunity for data theft. Also, it's a really opportunity for it to be just people sending emails that look like they're from you, but they're not. Also wanted to touch on network computers running slower than normal. You've probably seen in the news a lot of stories about this company got hit with malware. This company is facing data extortion demands. You know, this hospital or that large organization experienced a demand for several $1 million to unlock their data. One of the first things you'll see when you've fallen victim to a network that has been it's being encrypted by a hacker or being accessed by a hacker, you'll often see computers running a lot slower than normal. Things will just be unbearably slow and you can't figure out why. And it may be initially restricted to a couple computers, and then you'll find that it spreads from there to most computers, and you may see equipment like the firewall or the switching kind of locking up on you. That may be an indication that you are having malware spread throughout your network. So that's a red flag. If there's computers running slower than normal, you may have malware that's encrypting your data or monitoring your keystrokes. There's a bunch of different attack possibilities. But be confident that your computers are running up to speed, and don't just ignore the fact that they're running slower than normal because there may be an indication of an attack there. I think that's all I wanted to cover on spot data theft. You can go to the next slide, Taylor. All right, monitoring of EFIN and PTIN. So short summary, IRS advises weekly checks for how many returns have been filed. And the purpose of those checks would be to understand if they correspond effectively for what number of returns you've expected to be filed. So you can check these totals online, and you can contact the IRS e-help desk or file a form for misuse. One thing I wanted to point out in this section of the document is demonstrating compliance by keeping a record of those weekly checks. If your company has or uses a security portal to keep track of a bunch of different things, but among them log monitoring, that's a perfect place to put a record of weekly checks. Not only will it provide you with information that you know how many returns were filed according to the IRS at any given time, but it'll also demonstrate that you're doing your due diligence and that it's not negligence on your part if there was a breach that caused spurious filings, things like that. You can go to the next slide, Taylor. Next point, recognizing phishing scams. And I was really excited when I got to talk about this, because phishing is a fascinating area of technology threat right now. First, phishing is huge. Like, we see phishing all over the place, and we've seen people fall prey to phishing scams. But very simply, phishing is when scammers use email or even text to trick you into giving them your personal information. And what makes it difficult is the actual attack is to trick you into surrendering that information voluntarily. So it's difficult to protect against some of the stuff that would compromise your information, because even if your system is completely secure, if you give away the information on how to get in, then that compromise is difficult to defend against. So phishing largely represents a social engineering aspect, where they're tricking your employees, they're tricking you to give them voluntarily your personal information. And usually what we've seen is that phishing involves a fake website or a fake, so that you'll get a legitimate looking email, and that legitimate looking email will have a link in it, and that link will take you to a legitimate looking website. It's not, it's a fake website that will then ask you to sign in. All right, it'll ask you to sign into your Office 365. It'll ask you to sign into whatever service, or it'll try to collect information on that website. Again, it looks legitimate. It may look like a password reset email. We'll show an example in just a minute here. But that information, that fake website that looks identical to the actual Microsoft Office 365 sign-in, for example, doesn't actually go to Microsoft Office 365. It just goes to the hacker's database. And as soon as you type in your information on that website, they have your password. So yeah, that's what phishing is in as broad overview. Spear phishing is a specific type of phishing where they take additional information about you and they incorporate it into the initial email. So it's more targeted. Uh, Examples that we've seen of this is if you have a company website that says so and so is in this position, they might contact that person to request things that are specific to that position, right? So if it's a bookkeeper position or a CFO position, they might request that please change my direct deposit for my payroll to this bank account. Well, guess what happens when you do that? That money goes directly to the scammer, right? Another example we've seen of spear phishing that's pretty common is people will receive a message that looks legit and it contains your current password. And you say, well, this obviously is not just anyone out there. They know my current password. Again, maybe and maybe not. Passwords are available in large quantities on the internet from compromised services. Taylor, you already touched on password reuse, where when a provider of one type gets compromised, let's say your Netflix account gets compromised, right? Because Netflix has a big compromise and a whole bunch of Netflix passwords get shared. Well, if you use that same password elsewhere, then it can be confusing where the source of that breach actually occurred. So you can say, well, this is obviously still my Microsoft 365 login. They already know it. It must be legitimate. Not necessarily. Just because someone sends you an email with your current password doesn't mean they're a trusted internal resource. And that's kind of the basic premise of phishing, right? Usually it involves posing as someone you already know and trust. And that can be your IT provider, that can be your data storage provider, that can be your email provider. It could be someone on the team that you work with, right? Often phishing scams take place where we've seen a phishing scam that occurs where companies receive a message from the president and they say, hey, please buy me some gift cards. I'm in a meeting, I'm busy. And we've seen people fall for it. We've seen multiple instances of people falling for that. They received an email that said, please buy me a bunch of gift cards. And they went out and bought a bunch of gift cards and got back to the president and said, here's the gift cards, what do you need? And the president said, well, what do you mean? What do I need? The scammer in that case was hoping that the person would reply directly to the email. So the loss was actually prevented. But in one case, we were aware of an organization where they had like $800 in gift cards that they had to figure out how to spend because there wasn't returning available, which fortunately they didn't lose any money on it. I think that's most of what I wanted to cover on the phishing. I got just personal story here. The personal engineering, social engineering aspect of what one of the most successful viruses that I've seen spread by email. This was about 20 years ago, and it was the I love you virus. And it was simply an email that came from coworker and had the subject line, I love you, and an attachment. And that attachment proved irresistible for people to open. It's not necessarily the same as a phishing scam because they're not asking the person to take action at that point in time. In that instance, it was actually a virus. But ultimately, it shows the power of social engineering, right? Social engineering can trick people into doing things that they otherwise wouldn't find acceptable per company policy. And here's an example of a phishing email. We'll pop that up on the screen. This is actually not a real phishing email. This is a training simulation that we run. And I got this example phishing email earlier this week. And I liked it a lot because it looks really similar to what I would expect from an email from Microsoft Office, right? It looks like your office shows suspicious activity. You probably should change your password. And you click on the link to go change your password thinking, oh, I want to protect my account. And then you get a page looking like the Office 365 password change page where you enter your current password and then you enter your new password. And we've seen people fall prey to this, right? And the next thing that happens is that once you've filled out that quote unquote password reset page, the hacker then uses the information you provided to go log into your actual email account and your actual data storage account. So that's what phishing looks like. Again, this is a simulation here. We have an extension in our email that we can check to see if this is a simulation. That's part of our ongoing training, where you click and you say, is this a training phishing email? And in this case, it was. But I wanted to show it because I really liked it. It looked really legit. Let's go to the next slide, Taylor. Okay, we're going to cover the section talking about be safe on the internet. This is a really wide topic, and they've got some suggestions in this section of the document from the IRS. Again, this is largely just best practice for everyone. So most of the stuff that we're going to point out is just best practice type stuff. But I think if I wanted to summarize the biggest thing that I would encourage companies to use as an approach to being safe on the internet, it is multi-factor authentication. A lot of the attack vectors, the threat vectors that we see out there involve getting hold of a user's username and password. When you introduce an additional layer of authentication, a text message or an email that you've got to click on the verification link, or in most cases, what we prefer is a time-based code that times out every 30 seconds. That's becoming pretty ubiquitous. That's something that's available almost everywhere now, that there's a major provider involved. And it really is the silver bullet. So running back to the phishing simulation, right? We saw a breach not too long ago with an organization that they received a phishing email, and it said something very similar to, please click here to reset your password or log in to make sure your account's not deactivated. They clicked there, and they entered their username and password into the hacker's website that looked very legitimate. And the next thing we saw was logging into that organization's environment from an overseas location, right? We saw logins from France, and due to COVID, everyone's locked down. We know that nobody's in France right now. This should not be happening. So we hustled to implement multi-factor authentication, which really is the silver bullet there. And it makes people, when they sign in, have to have that second piece of information, whether it's an app on their smartphone or recipient of that text message that has that 6-digit code. That keeps your account safe from hackers in a way that we are really, it's not impossible to fool, but most of the attacks that are out there today, it will stop. So that's my number one. Like if you do nothing else as a result of this webinar, go implement multi-factor authentication everywhere, and your accounts will be way less likely to get hacked. The number two would really be, we'd really encourage never to record documents, passwords in a document, an Excel file, a text file, a notepad file, a note on your phone. We really see that's just way too common, and those things are really easy for viruses and hacker tools to pick up, right? And you can find those, because indexing, right? The ability to find your files, like where was that Word document that I had the stuff in, and you can search your hard drive or your online service really quickly and easily for that information. That's the same thing that a malware tool can do and get a bunch of passwords from you. So don't do that. And again, if you currently do this, don't feel bad. Lots of people do it. But we recommend using a password manager, and so does the IRS, right? 1Password is the name of a password manager. That is our favorite tool. It's really convenient, and it allows teams to share passwords back and forth in a secure manner. And again, the big piece here is not reuse passwords between different sites. So I buy stuff on Amazon all the time. I don't currently know what my company Amazon password is because it's computer generated. It's stored in 1Password. I never see it. I just hit the button to paste it in when I need it. They also recommend using a modern browser. Chrome, Firefox, Edge are all great examples of these. I'm personally, among IT people, web browsers are a source of constant interest. And my current favorite browser is, there's a new Chromium version of Microsoft Edge. It's based on Chrome, but it has some of the security features of Edge built into it. So that's fabulous. Make sure your browser is being updated. Highly recommend you avoid Internet Explorer unless there really is no other option. Internet Explorer is an old browser, and there was some specific software that was written for Internet Explorer that may still be in use, especially in when you're interacting with taxes, right? So you may have no choice in some cases. So if you have to, make sure to apply all your Windows updates. That'll make sure Windows Internet Explorer will be fully patched as best as possible. But ultimately, it's an old browser. Don't use it unless you have to. And Taylor, you mentioned this already, use security software on your devices, right? And this is just kind of base level stuff. Make sure your security software is up to date. As an IT provider, we often get asked, like, what's the best antivirus tool, or what's the best security software? And honestly, while there are some differences, right, some differences in detection rates, and we've actually switched providers for security software in working with our clients because of specific threats that weren't captured. The majority of products out there will catch the majority of your baseline stuff. So the answer for which is the best security software to use on your devices is the one that you actually are familiar with, and make sure it's up to date. So yeah, security software, big important thing to make sure it's covering all your devices, right? Rather than jumping from product to product, if you have a single product that you can make sure covers all your devices and does a good job at it and is up to date. I'm going to field a question just on the fly here. Chrome's and most browsers have the ability to save passwords directly in the browser itself as a store password option. We recommend against using that. It's not a particularly safe space, and other tools can steal it. We really recommend turning that function off. And we have a separate webinar that may be applicable here. Taylor, you and Josiah did a webinar on digital hygiene, where he talks about some of that stuff. Next bullet point: encrypt data at rest. Right? If your data resides on a laptop, for example, this is especially important. Encrypting the hard drive on that laptop using a built-in tool like BitLocker for Windows or FileVault for Mac is extremely important. That way, in the event of a loss, you can not have the assumption that you lost any data, that any information was compromised, because that data was all encrypted and not presumed secure, not presumed compromised. Also recommending encrypting data in transit, right? Don't email using regular email. Protected information, confidential information, use a secure email tool. Microsoft has one that's built in with one of their licensing for their Office 365 mail. Also, a lot of tax prep software have a secure client portal, or you might be using a secure client data transfer tool like ShareFile or something like that. But avoid just sending stuff. And then obviously look for the HTTPS in the browser web browser bar. That indicates that the website, at least the transmission of data between you and the website, is secure. It doesn't mean that the website itself is secure. It just means that it's going to be secure in getting there. So it's an indication that things are on the right structure for secure type of communications. And then lastly, avoid public Wi-Fi. Use a built-in use a VPN if public Wi-Fi is actually necessary. So a VPN will encrypt your traffic to and from the internet. Again, it doesn't magically make everything secure, but it will encrypt that portion of the information. So if you're using public Wi-Fi, it will be encrypted when it leaves your computer, crosses that public Wi-Fi zone until some other further point in the internet where it gets dropped off as regular traffic again. So if the risk vector is that public Wi-Fi space, then you can protect against that by using a VPN.
Awesome, Justin. Thanks so much for covering those sections. And yeah, lots of information there. I think probably one of the things that stood out to me was definitely just kind of how manipulative phishing campaigns can be. And one thing I've learned a lot is seeing how they really prey on people that maybe haven't watched a webinar like this, that haven't seen what our best practices or haven't been trained. And I think it preys on people that that are even less educated than your average user. And so I think that's one thing. And then with the password managers, another thing I learned recently, I think that's a great thing, is the fact that it's so secure. It has not only is it's multi-factor authentication, plus it has a master password above that, or the emergency code above that, makes it kind of a 3-step security process versus just 2 of what you get normally, which is pretty cool. But yeah, definitely lots of great information. Thanks, Justin, for sharing all that. Before we get to a Q&A and get to a couple more of your guys' questions, Kevin, let's talk about how to report and respond in a situation, God forbid something were to happen.
Yeah, totally. Let's cover that. This will be pretty brief. The IRS, they have pretty clear guidelines on what to do when this kind of stuff happens, and there's also a lot of people out there who can help during this process. Obviously, the first section is to just report the data loss to the IRS, and you're basically your local state or where you're preparing taxes, state returns for people. So yeah, there are 3 groups of people that they tell you to contact. Or you first obviously contact the IRS and tell them what's happened, and they usually recommend you reach out to your local police and law enforcement, and then they will also continue to give you guidance if they want you to reach out to either the FBI or Secret Service, depending on the breach. Then they recommend that you contact the states in which you prepare state returns. Inside of those states, you will email like the Federation of Tax Administrators, and then the state attorney general for each state. And then the last group that they usually recommend you reach out to is experts, whether that both they recommend security experts to help determine, where the breach occurred or how it happened, trying to find that weakness or vulnerability of how they got in, whether it be in email phishing, like what Justin and Taylor have mentioned, or whether it may be a virus that allowed someone to get into one of your systems. And then another expert they recommend is insurance companies. Insurance companies for cybersecurity can provide a lot of insight in how to deal with these kind of breaches. And then moving on from there, once you've reported it, then the next action is to respond and to recover from that data loss. The IRS has pretty good recommendations, basically like, hey, keep your IRS stakeholder liaison updated with developments, because the IRS doesn't really allow for third-party reports. So you're kind of that person who's interacting directly with the IRS, and then you use other people's information and pass that on to the IRS. The FTC has a really nice guideline for how to respond to your clients and when a breach occurs, if it affects them, and how you should interact with your clients on that, which is really helpful. The obvious one is determining how the intrusion or theft occurred, and then making any changes before you get a new EFIN, which will happen in some cases depending on what's happened and the size of breach and data there. One big one we highly recommend is also developing a continuity plan. When things go down or you have that data loss, having a plan for what's going to happen in that scenario. How can you quickly recover, get back on your feet, and continue working and helping your clients with their needs. And part of that continuity plan is making backups. I know Taylor touched on cloud backups, making sure they're encrypted. This is very important, just at day-to-day operations, not only for not just for breaches, but also for data loss in general, whether it be a virus or hardware failure. Backups are extremely important in that case to help you quickly get back up from an outage or a breach in that case, so that you're not losing valuable information and time when working with your clients. And finally, one last recommendation that they talk about is, I mentioned, consulting with your insurance provider. They have security experts that they can put you in touch with when trying to recover from theft and and even providing those security experts to analyze what protections you have in place or don't have in place, and how to detect intrusions going forward.
Thanks, Kevin. That's great. Yeah, I think the one thing that stood out to me, especially in this area and in general, is having that plan in place. Whether you're not in a crisis situation, definitely being proactive and having those plans in place of, hey, if something were to happen, what are we going to do? That way, it's God, like I said, God forbid something were to happen, you have a system in place to recover and quickly get back, especially when it comes to getting back up and running. Because I know, as we experience with clients, it can be, not only is it the embarrassment or the risk or the liability, but it's just the disruption to the business. When you have an outage or any sort of malware, any sort of breach, any sort of compromise, it's just extremely disruptive to the business flow. So great. Well, I know we're on the close to the top of the hour here. And we have a couple more questions coming in that we're going to address here, but I want to cover one more area before we jump to that. Two more areas. One being kind of wrapping up with the FTC safeguard rules, and kind of I talked about this at the beginning, but essentially these are kind of the blanket standard foundation for all financial institutions that CPAs and tax preparers fall under. And most of the stuff we've talked about it falls under even their guidelines as well. Everything we've talked about has. And then kind of some of the additional things would be things like having that security plan in place, having a security officer in place, ensuring, the IRS recommends you bring in a third party after the fact if you had a breach, whereas the FTC actually recommends you have a service provider in place ongoing, have providers that are maintaining your cybersecurity ongoing. So those are some things to look at, but most of their guidelines are pretty generic for all financial institutions, and a lot of what we covered covers into that. So kind of our big four, and this actually answers one of the questions that came into the Q&A, which is, how do I ensure that my IT provider is keeping our data secure? There are a lot of people out there offering cloud services. So if you currently if you're currently questioning any sort of IT or cybersecurity concerns when it comes to being secure or being compliant with the IRS, there's really 4 areas that if these areas aren't in place, or if you're not doing these already, we would question whether your IT provider, or you should question whether your IT provider or your current IT department is making sure you're compliant. So first one being policies and procedures. We've talked about this a bunch, but there's a stack of policies that you should have, whether it's for data loss, whether it's for how do we delete things, how do we onboard new employees, how do we terminate employees, how do we manage our data, where do we store it, all that fun stuff. The second one we talked about is training. Having a regular training program, not only something that is a compliance issue, but it's something just a best practice that all organizations should have in place to keep people current. I know, Justin, I actually got that same email earlier this week from Microsoft in our training phishing campaign. And I almost clicked on it. I was so close to clicking on it because it was so good and so convincing, even though I get trained every week. I get these emails every week. So being trained, being identified, keeping yourself on your toes to make sure you don't have an issue and you don't have anything slip through, especially with all the socially engineered attacks. We saw in 2019 an exponential rise, and that's why we're doing this webinar and expanded our services when it comes to cybersecurity, is because of so many social engineered attacks. And then the third thing would be annual risk assessment, making sure that every year you're doing a comprehensive risk assessment of your entire organization and basically benchmarking it every year to make sure things haven't changed, reevaluate your technology. We know technology changes all the time, so we need to constantly be evaluating it. And number 4, if you haven't already gone through an assessment or a questionnaire with the IRS or a third party or vendor, that's something that if you haven't already gone through that, when you do go through it, you'll understand what we're talking about and why it's so important to be ready for that, because those are a very rigorous process. And sometimes it may be the IRS asking you to be compliant, maybe you get audited, or maybe it's a vendor or client that says, hey, you make sure unless we're not going to give you our data unless you have these specific policies, procedures, training, and usually those questionnaires and assessments are quite rigorous, and your IT department or IT provider should take you through that. These are the 4 big things we provide our clients, and are things that we implement for ourselves and for our cybersecurity clients, and we recommend to everyone. Fantastic. I know we're going a little bit over time, and I believe we've covered pretty much all the questions. There's one other question that came in, which was on file sharing and recommending, where you store your files. I know we use SharePoint and Microsoft 365 because we love all the Microsoft products and use that a lot. And then there's, depending on your organization, there's, and other tools you use. I think that would be the biggest point, would be what other tools you use, and how do those tools integrate with your file storage. But yeah, Dropbox is great. File Share is also great. ShareFile, and yeah, so those are great solutions. SharePoint is awesome and something we love as well.
Love to chime in on that, Taylor, really briefly. Dropbox can be great, but it really depends on how you implement it. For example, if you synchronize the contents of your Dropbox folder, which contains client data, and you synchronize that on your personal computer as well as your work computer as well as your employees' home computers, you may have data on locations that you don't actually control, and you don't have record of antivirus software being on them and things like that. So depending on how it's implemented, those cloud-based tools can be either fantastic or a security risk. But Dropbox is one that's really flexible that way. We really like ShareFile for its ability to provide a secure client portal and avoid emailing client data directly to clients. So just on the 2 that were specifically questioned about, Dropbox and ShareFile, we really like ShareFile.
Thanks, Justin. That's super helpful. And yeah, great point. I know even Google Drive has that same thing where just has the ability to be able to sync really well to all your different pieces of hardware. And then you find yourself backing up or storing things in places you don't know. So yeah, it's a good point. Backing up the cloud storage, and then where are things being synced to is another part of that. Fantastic. Well, we are running over time here. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks Justin and Kevin for participating and being a part. It's been super fun. If you guys have any additional questions, if you're interested in kind of the big 4 or how to implement those areas of cybersecurity in your organization, please reach out to us. Our email is on the screen. I'd be happy to talk to you about how we can support your organization if you have any questions. Thanks again. Like I mentioned, we will be sending a recording of this webinar and the slides. So look forward to that email in the next couple of days. Thanks again. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Taylor.